Hi everyone, welcome to today's FinTech panel webinar, hosted by Deloitte Propel. My name's Gemma Taylor and I'm the technology lead for Deloitte Propel, which is a team within Deloitte focused on supporting startups and small to medium-sized businesses. Today I'll be hosting a panel discussion focused on the emerging trends in the FinTech industry. I hope the discussion today will help to demystify FinTech, which is an emerging industry focused on using tech to solve financial challenges and build accessible solutions. Today we'll be focusing on both existing and emerging FinTech trends and discussing ways in which businesses can leverage the latest technology. During the panel session, we'll run through a number of hot topics, including emerging technology to be aware of, the industries we predict will be disrupted by FinTech, the risks associated with the use of FinTech, and where to go to find out more about what's happening in the FinTech space. We will then go to Q&A to cover off any questions that come up from the audience during the course of the webinar. In Deloitte Propel, we work with hundreds of ambitious startups and small to medium-sized companies to provide them with market-leading financial technology and access to a range of products and services to help them grow. We also work with a number of FinTech partners, 3 of which are joining us in the panel today, who are constantly evolving and developing their products to incorporate the latest developments in the FinTech industry. I'd like to introduce our 4 guests today who will be joining us for the panel session. First, I'd like to introduce Louise, the head of Deloitte FinTech in the UK and North and South Europe. Edward Berks, the head of FinTech at Xero, leading engagement with banks, FinTech companies and their app ecosystem partners. I'm also joined by Rostom, senior product manager at Fractal Labs, and Matt Perkins, Head of Partnerships at FreeAgent. I'll now hand you over to our panel guests to introduce themselves in some more detail. Louise, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Gemma. Yes. Good afternoon. My name's Louise Brett. I lead FinTech and financial innovation across the UK and North and South Europe, as Gemma mentioned. And what does that role mean? It means at Deloitte we are looking at the way FinTech can disrupt and enhance the services that our heritage clients can offer the market and the new clients can offer the market. And this is all to make it better. This is not disruption for disruption's sake. It is absolutely using the capabilities of exponential data, disruptive technologies, and a need to bring purpose and solutions to the end consumer.
Thanks. So Xero started life as a cloud accounting company. Focused on providing accounting solutions for small businesses. We now have 1.8 million small businesses around the world on our platform. And actually beyond just filing tax properly and running finances, small businesses have a need to access business applications and financial services, whether that be credit or solutions to make and receive payments, for example, from a cash flow perspective. And so what we've done over time is built out a set of relationships and solutions that really enable Xero to be a small business platform on which we now have a whole host of banking and FinTech and business application participants serving our clients, and that's the part of the business for which I'm responsible.
So Fractal is fundamentally changing the way SMEs access financial services, and how we do this is through a partnership with financial institutions such as banks, auditors, insurers and card issuers. So to give a bit of backstory, Fractal started in 2014 building cash flow tools on the back of accounting data, and what we realised around the time where open banking was announced is that there was a missing piece, and that was understanding the underlying banking data. So what we've been focusing our time on is understanding the relationship between banking data and accounting data, and then building and providing a bunch of tools on the back of that, such as forecasting. We've recently made a move to an API play, where we're issuing our APIs to our partners, and we're enabling them to build entirely new propositions. So the 2 APIs we have right now are data aggregation and data intelligence.
I'm Matt from FreeAgent. FreeAgent's a UK-based software accounting for us as a service, based in sunny Edinburgh, as we say. And we've, the interesting thing for us is that when we started out all those years ago, where we're coming to now with all the FinTech new players in the market is great, because it's what we've always kind of had a vision of, is that your accounting software is in the middle of everything as a business, and we were acquired last year by RBS NatWest. So it's opened up a huge number of these new fintech propositions, lending and cash flow forecasting, all kinds of things. So my role in FreeAgent is to work on those integrations, on those partnerships, and also work with the fintech accelerators as well at NatWest. So again, some exciting fintech businesses coming through there as well. So really exciting times.
Awesome, thank you. And of course, goes without saying, we're delighted to have everyone here today. So thank you so much for participating in the panel. And to start with, we kind of wanted to really get back to basics. So a question, Louise, if you wouldn't mind starting. Can you please describe what the term kind of fintech means in basic terms?
I'd be delighted to, because there are lots of definitions out there. So let me talk about how we talk about fintech at Deloitte. And it is technology companies that are at startup or scale-up mode, applying their services and their ideas and their solutions to financial services. So they're not regulated in their own right necessarily, some are, but they are actually solving for financial services problems and opportunities as tech-enabled companies.
Wonderful, thank you. And it would be great to hear a bit more about the emerging fintech trends that kind of excite you the most. Would you mind starting, Edward?
Yeah, so I would have to say that small business is the area that we're most familiar with, and I think fintech is disrupting really all areas of commerce. Wherever a business is trading, they need to kind of make payments, get paid, access capital, etc. But in the small business space, I think one of the most exciting things is that there are a whole bunch of products. If you think about trade finance and trade insurance, for example, that have very much been the preserve of large businesses because the underwriting processes have just been so manual and so clunky that suddenly get opened up through the economics and the delivery mechanisms of the internet. And there's just a whole host of new credit and lending propositions coming to market. And in the SME space, it's needed. So there's a huge shortfall between the credit and capital that small businesses need. And the capital that they're actually able to access, so that we see 50,000 small businesses each year failing because of lack of access to credit and capital. So to see that addressed through fintech, I think would be hugely exciting.
Awesome, great.
Thanks. So to echo what you were just saying about how fintech is impacting all forms of commerce for businesses, we're big believers that fintech is impacting all forms of industries and all forms of companies. So last year there was some research done into the mobile payment space, and what we found is actually Starbucks was doing more payments than any other payment provider, whether it was Apple Pay and Google Pay. And the reason for this is because I think all businesses want to control the money in and out of their business. So I think everyone's been seeing fintech as solely attached to financial services, but I think what we're really going to see is fintech is going to be a part of every form of business.
I couldn't agree more. When I'm saying the definition we work to is applied to financial services, payments is the thing that pervades every sector. And at the moment that's the owned by financial services, the sector itself as a provision in that way, but clearly going forward, that's something that is totally opening up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think you've stolen my ones. I totally agree. It's the access to finance is a huge thing. Most businesses are viable if they can just get through those stages of keeping their cash flow going, and so that access to the funds that they just traditionally have had that problem accessing, and then payments is a massive one. I kind of mentioned before I used to work for one of those big payment providers, and just seeing it's a thing that goes every single time we do questionnaires about what the biggest things that affect you. Getting paid is a huge one, and those payment providers that are coming through and opening up are going to make a real big difference, I think.
Great. So the next question. So banking is obviously a very obvious industry that's going to be disrupted by fintech. Can you give any insights into kind of specific ways in which that the banking industry might be disrupted, as well as any other industries you can think of?
So I think banking itself is thinking what is its purpose going forward, and how should it deliver on that purpose in this day and age of societal good and these macro trends that are going on. And I think banks alone, or banking alone, is saying how can I collaborate with fintechs to reach that end goal quicker? You mentioned RBS. I was judging a hackathon up there last weekend with Alison Rose, the Deputy CEO, and the CEO of Innovate Finance, the trade body for fintech. And the subject of that hackathon was financial inclusion. So banking is trying to include the excluded. Fintechs are coming up with some really neat solutions to include the excluded. And I think that's a trend we'll see more and more.
Great.
Yeah, I think the evidence is perhaps stronger in London and the UK than some other markets, although Europe I think is again really exciting as you look at the convergence between banking and business applications and accounting. All the banks that we speak to are keen to play a greater role there in the business context. I think if you ask around amongst your friends, how many people are actually having their salary paid into a Monzo now, and that's a thing. People are beginning to do that. So I think we've moved beyond a phase where people are playing with some of these fintech propositions and actually beginning to run their personal accounts and business accounts on platforms like Tide. I think Tide are coming up for 100,000 customers now in the small business banking space. I mean, it's a very real shift where I think the benefits of much easier onboarding, perhaps a better overall service experience are beginning to win customers.
So one way I think fintech is disrupting is e-commerce. So if you look at Amazon, for example, it's providing trade finance at point of sale for online for these small businesses and merchants who are selling all their stock on Amazon. And then we look at fintechs like Klarna, who are helping various different online commerce stores to smooth out that customer journey at the point of sale. Traditionally, if you wanted a credit card to buy a nice pair of shoes or something, you'd have to go to the bank, register for a credit card. Now what we're seeing with companies like Klarna and ASOS, for example, you have an instant access to that type of finance that you need for that purchase. So it's really smoothed out the process for consumers. Another exciting area of disruption, I think, is if we look to China and see what they're doing with WeChat. Most millennials and even people that aren't millennials are running their entire lives just on WeChat, whether it's paying for their taxis or cinemas or anything really. So I think it's a great example of where fintech is impacting everything.
And in bars and restaurants and coffee shops, and festivals actually. So it's on festival season at the moment. You would go to places just a year or two ago and you have to have cash and that's a huge change. The EPOS systems that are coming out now, and people like Good Till, and there's a few big ones that are coming through at the moment. And with all these built-in things like reward schemes and everything, so it's always been the case. I used to work for Business Link a few years back, and the change over those last sort of 10 years or so, just looking at the access that these SMEs have to these systems and to the tech that help them to build their business like that. It's incredible.
Matt, if we could start with you, could you tell us about some of the innovations in the fintech space that FreeAgent are adopting to enhance the product?
Yeah, sure. So, as I kind of mentioned before, we've always had this kind of idea of your accounting software being a central part of your business, and it's always been a bit difficult because even submitting your VAT return and things like that, they're all really useful and helpful kind of developments. But you submit your VAT return, you can't actually pay directly through the software. So there's very simple things like that. So looking at ways that you can actually make payments outwards from FreeAgent. But a big thing for us, and we've kind of touched on it already, is the access to finance piece in particular.
Yeah.
So we kind of work on an insights basis. So more and more using products like Fractal, looking at producing these insights based on your on the data that's in the software. And traditionally, businesses have had to wait, retrospectively after their accountant comes back to them a year later on and trying to get the feel. Now we have that kind of live view of your accounting, and also I know it's vilified a little bit, making tax digital. So that's kind of making people become much more up to date and live with their accounting data. It means that you can then look at that data. Say you've got sort of £10,000 in invoices that are there ready to be paid. You can, using fintech systems, we can say, okay, probably these are likely to be paid really good credit rating on 4 or 5 of these, and people can pick and choose those invoices that they want to actually take the money forward from. So that's a big thing, is really making sure that people are able to access the finance that they've got there. And we also spoke about it earlier as well, is payments is the big thing for us as well. Not just payments within FreeAgent, but what we're seeing is, we have a lot more customers coming on board now who, so many people are selling online, whether it's a side business or whether it is a key part of their business. And we've taken a very strong view that we can't build everything that people want. So I mentioned coffee shops and cafes earlier. Relying on some of those amazing platforms that will do all of the stock control, look after all the day-to-day transactions, and then push them into FreeAgent. So that really makes. Accounting software always had 2 problems, and you'll notice it, is that it's a tech thing. So some people can't even change the TV over sometimes. It's difficult. So, and then also accounting. It's not the most exciting thing to most business owners who are keen to grow their business with the skills that they have. So being able to kind of make it easy, make it simple, automate a lot of that data, and then provide solutions through insights is a real big thing that we're working on.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that comes through from FreeAgent around kind of awareness and accessibility.
Sure.
Great, thank you. And Yas, moving on to you, are you able to kind of share some of the insights that you're adopting at Fractal? I mean, probably a lot around kind of accessibility of data as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fractal actually aggregates data from customers who use both Xero and FreeAgent, both who have amazing APIs, and it made it very easy for us to aggregate and get that rich data that we need to help businesses. So one of the things that we focus on is unifying a profile of all the different data sources that an SME might have. So that's banking data, accounting data, it could be payment portals they use such as Stripe. We also pull a bunch of data from Companies House to sort of enrich the data that we have of the business. One of the things that enables us to do is derive insight on the invoices. So traditionally SMEs might look at due dates as a way of thinking what they might need to pay and what they can expect in. And in most cases, it's never reality, because we all know the UK have a late payments problem. So one thing we like to focus on is understanding behaviour of suppliers and customers. So we facilitate these new ways of nudging your small businesses to do something not after the fact, which we've found that some SMEs who don't have accounting expertise sort of rely on once the books have been reconciled, once the invoices are in, I'm able to make a decision. But in most cases, that's too late. So we're using a bunch of prediction methods to use both of these data sources to tell the business, you need to do something now. Go and get this invoice factored, or chase this customer now, because he traditionally pays you 10 days plus on your due date, and that's not enough for them. So it's really reconciling all these data sources and giving them a unique view that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Great, yeah, and I think everyone knows the statement, cash is king, especially for startups, and having that oversight over, what's coming in, what's going out, when certain activities in your bank transaction history kind of might happen. That's really, really key. So, great. Edward, are you okay to give an insight into what you're doing at Xero?
Yeah, of course. So I think there's probably 3 areas that we continue to work really hard in. If you think about the core task of accounting and bookkeeping, not the most glamorous thing in the world, but actually it's often a question of taking a bunch of transaction data that originates from banks and payment services and employee expenses, and digitizing all of those data sources so that you can then prepare your accounts and file the right amount of tax. We have 750 partners now in our ecosystem who have built an API integration into Xero, which at the lowest level just automates bringing that data onto the platform. We call it data automation, and it streamlines the front end of bookkeeping, but it's a huge win for our accounting partners. So about half of all UK accountants now are Xero partners, and it's just saving them lots and lots of time. So that's kind of the first level. The next level is then thinking about what are the things that small businesses do that would provide a context in which they're likely to want to access a service. So when I'm raising an invoice, actually that's probably the time on our platform to say, well, could you take this as a card payment, right? Could we work with somebody like Stripe and surface that as a proposition, or go cardless if it's a recurring payment, for example. So we are bringing some of those partnerships much deeper onto our platform so that they're absolutely embedded into the right workflows that small businesses have. And then, yeah, as you've touched on this, I guess it's using all the data insights that we have around small businesses to try and support prompting actually not only the small businesses but their accountants to bring forward the right propositions at the right time to address. I think there's this overarching issue of cash flow. I guess just one interesting point, we now have, as we approach 500,000 customers on the platform, really deep insights, aggregated and anonymised insights about what's going on with those small businesses in terms of their cash flow, their employment, cross-border trading. There's a whole bunch of progress that we can track around those businesses. And actually in a typical month, barely half of UK small businesses are cash flow positive. It's a huge, huge issue. And I think the kind of things that we're talking about here has the potential to make a real difference to small business. So very, very important.
Absolutely, thanks Edward. And Louise, it would be great if you could tell us some more about what Deloitte are doing in the fintech space, specifically around working with kind of early stage, growth stage fintech companies.
Sure. It's probably worth just contextualising this in there's 4 areas Deloitte goes to market in around fintech. The first is shaping the narrative and having an opinion and being part of the conversation. And we launched a report late last year with the City UK called Splitting the Bill. And it was, how do you create shared services that can enable inclusion of fintechs into the financial services system? Because these are tedious processes that banks have to go through, and I'll use KYC as an example. It's important, they all have to invest in doing it, but there's no competitive advantage in doing it better than the next person. It is also a barrier to entry to fintechs and startup organisations in having to get through those compliance hurdles. And that's an example of the kind of first point. The second is, how do we help our incumbent main clients, our heritage financial services clients, to innovate faster, to extend their reach into their consumer bases through partnering better with fintechs. And it's all around the innovation agenda. So we see our role in bringing together fintechs that we find interesting, that we believe have a role to play, understanding the problems our clients have and saying, how do we fix that? And collaboration is absolutely key there. The third area is the fintechs themselves. Our mission statement is to be the firm that fintechs most want to work with. So how do we become relevant at a level that, the Deloitte brand is a pretty high end brand and sort of sounds like it's going to be kind of costly, I think, sometimes. Now, how do we disrupt our own services to be highly relevant to the fintechs in their startup and scale up journeys? And Propel is a wonderful example of that, in that we're partnering with fintech to deliver services that really work for the smaller companies on their growth stage. And the fourth area is actually investing in fintechs ourselves. We have a very small portfolio fund to do some small investments, but the point of it isn't to make big capital returns. It's absolutely to be able to advise the whole ecosystem by having been in it with our fintech partners at their stages of growth. And we recently announced that we've taken a stake in Fractal. So we're kind of wanting to be around the whole agenda.
Silicon Valley, New York, London and Hong Kong are known as the epicentres of fintech innovation and investment. So I'd like to hear from the panel around which kind of locations do you think the most exciting developments are in fintech. Matt, are you okay to begin?
Gosh, yes. Well, so because we're very much UK based, we're based in Edinburgh, so there's lots of things going on in Edinburgh. Obviously, London. I think, as I kind of mentioned, we work with there's 12 accelerators around the country that we work with, and while there's 2 particularly focused on fintech, you get these fintech startups all around. So we have regular. So tomorrow I'm at one, and then Thursday as well. We get the key fintech businesses together to do these kind of round table events, which are just really, really useful because people get to talk to each other and kind of share ideas and actually pick up some really, really interesting new startups. And as I mentioned, we're part of RBS, so RBS also have links with fintech accelerators all around the world actually, but in Israel, for example. There's some really interesting fintech businesses coming out there as well. So I think we often sort of meet the fintech businesses as they've kind of evolved just past that initial kind of growth stage, unless we meet them in the accelerator. So I think there's sort of very much from all around we do see them.
I would say I think it's easy for us to feel really good about London, actually, and so we should. So certainly London is Europe's leading fintech capital. I think if one attends something like Money 2020, the regional variations, particularly around payments, actually is crazy. The amount of payment companies that grow up in particular regions and operate in a particular way. And I think when you compare Europe to the US where so much money is still moved around on checks, feels like they have a long way to go. But I think any exposure one gets to Asian markets is really impactful. I think the scale and the rapidity of the innovation to which I think most of us day to day here are simply not exposed, I think actually is on another level. And I think if we look at things like payments being embedded into social experiences, etc., I think you can look for a wave of innovation, actual companies that will begin to play in European markets that absolutely are originating very, very quickly in China and India.
Absolutely. And whilst I totally believe that the leading hub is the UK and London at the centre of the UK globally, and it's a position we need to hold on to dearly. Absolutely. Because as I think we said in a report a while back, there's no other city that has the centre of financial services, the government and policy makers, the regulator and Silicon Roundabout within a tube ride of itself. And you look at America as the next big one, and you've got the West Coast where all the innovation's happening, and then the East Coast where actually the financial markets are located. So London has that perfect storm. However, I think the one centre that's absolutely on our heels is Singapore. And they are putting themselves, or they're competing with Hong Kong as the gateway to Asia. And the innovations they are sponsoring, the money they're putting into it, the Singapore FinTech Festival is absolutely huge. I think that's where it's exciting looking that way. And it's also, what can we learn and what can we export? I think it's also worth talking about the GFIN regulations that are going on, led by the UK regulator under Chris Woolard. And so some of the steps that have put the UK ahead of the world are being now copied, which is flattery by the world. And so London's brilliant. We've got our hubs and spokes, and we've talked about that. And certainly areas like Edinburgh and Scotland are very much being seen as real data centres of excellence. The Southwest is coming really up now. In fact, Deloitte is about to sponsor a Masters in FinTech in that area of the UK. It's hugely vibrant and really exciting.
And just picking up on your point around London being the kind of perfect storm between that fintech innovation and the actual financial service institution, can you tell me a bit about kind of how fintechs are collaborating with banks? I know you mentioned earlier that's one of the kind of cornerstones of what you're leading on, so it'd be great to hear some more about that too.
So many of the banks have their own accelerators and reach out programs or partnerships to even see what fintech talent is on its doorstep. A lot of them have done some very interesting public announcements, and clearly FreeAgent with RBS and NatWest is one of them. Also with the investment that HSBC took in Bud around their First Direct platform quite recently. There's some headlines, but it's actually what's happening below the headlines that is really interesting, where there's experimentation. They are looking at, most of the incumbent financial services organisations are building offerings, new offerings, neo offerings, and they're not doing it on their own in their old tech shops. They're absolutely opening out. They're looking at microservices architectures, and they're saying, how can we quickly bring that type of capability on board, and looking very much to the fintech market to help them do that.
Yeah. And do you see any kind of, Yaz, this might be one for you, what are the kind of barriers like when working with kind of very traditional banks?
I think one thing we found ourselves whilst working through banks is there's obviously a lot of legislation and regulatory issues when you're a bank, and to try and go to market with a quick and dirty product to satisfy those customer needs. It's very difficult to do that at a bank. Whereas I think partnering with fintechs seems to work for the banks because they're allowed to test these new market propositions very quickly. So you're sort of borrowing on the brand and the sort of the security of a bank, but then you get the agility and innovation of a startup. So I think the narrative when open banking was announced was very much that fintechs are going to disrupt banks. But now what we're seeing is fintechs and banks are cozying up to each other because they can both leverage from one another, and we're seeing much better propositions than we otherwise would see. Trust being one of the barriers for fintechs to sort of gain mass audience, whereas partnering with a bank gives you that sort of leeway to sort of borrow from.
Great. It'd be interesting to hear from you, Matt, as well.
Yeah. So just sort of following on from that, the interesting thing we're seeing as a really good example is sole traders, for example, have real trouble getting mortgages. And there's mortgage products out there, but it's really hard to get the information to kind of build a picture. So you find that the banks are kind of looking to fintech options to sort of say, how do we pull that data in? Still their traditional product, but they can make much better lending decisions based on the information that they can get through, which they wouldn't be able to access normally. So that's a real big difference that we've seen there as well. That's one that we've seen as we're working on projects on that kind of basis at the minute, and then you also see platforms that are kind of being bought by the banks. I mean, we're a good example of that. But then you also see things like Albert, which is a little invoicing app. Some guys there doing a really good job, and literally overnight, become part of Santander, I think. Yep. So just so there's all little bits of the jigsaw puzzle that are kind of getting put together, and then gluing them together. But that's going to be the interesting bit, to see kind of what gets taken together and what's what works, because as you're building these projects, you kind of realise that there's things that you need to build in or that just don't necessarily work, so there is quite, when a platform's developed, you have with yourself, for example, you have a very clear idea of where you want to go, and from a bank's point of view, they're kind of taking a bit of a spread bet on what they're going to bring in, and then hopefully building a product there. So I think they learn a lot. They're learning a lot from each other, and it's interesting to see it behind the scenes as we do.
I think the other development that we've seen more recently is the amount of corporate development funds, venture funds that have been set up by banks to get into the fintech market, without necessarily at this stage knowing which type of fintech and which product area, but wanting to invest. And certainly the amount of capital in that sector has been growing hugely recently.
Yeah. Actually, I would just add insight that as Deloitte, I think you'll have working with a cross-section of banks. There's even on something like the response to open banking, some banks are incredibly conservative, see that as a threat. Their compliance approach is minimum viable compliance. Others see it as an opportunity. And actually, I think to NatWest's great credit, actually, some of the work that's being done in the innovations group there, some of the businesses that are being spun up. I think NatWest is a bank that's really kind of got the bull by the horns and said, okay, how can we really leverage some of this change? I think also, irrespective of culture, a bank's ability to chase some of this, depending upon the state of their back-end core systems, again, varies very greatly. And actually, with the challenges that TSB had migrating core customers off Lloyd systems, for example, it's just difficult for banks to move. And again, coming back to the likes of Monzo and Revolut, we're starting to see some really significant customer bases on digital native banks. This idea that people will never have their salary paid into, they'll never have a mortgage with somebody that isn't an HSBC or an NatWest. I think that we're beyond that being a question now. I think undoubtedly there are really bright futures for digital native banks, Tide, Starlings and others. So a really, really interesting landscape, I think.
And at the end of the day, this is all about more choice for the consumer and better solutions. And I think, even those banks that are struggling to move at the pace they want to, through to very new fintech bank offerings who are struggling with some of the other demands on being a bank, like regulation and compliance. That continuum is all about getting a better consumer outcome, and I think that's the most exciting thing.
Yeah, agreed.
Definitely, thank you. Blockchain was one of the most popular fintech terms entered into online search engines last year, but it's often misunderstood. So I'd love to get kind of a brief overview, maybe from you, Louise, around what you would define as blockchain and why you think it's important.
So blockchain is this universal term, which actually it's distributed ledger technology is what it's talking about. And then it often means cryptocurrencies is kind of where it sort of morphs into. I think the case is very unproven about the blockchain currency or the cryptocurrency at the moment. And it's interesting, the recent Libra announcement with Facebook as to where that might be. And that's got a lot of press coverage. Where we are seeing it is where you can use it in trade. And the contracts for trade and big trade flows, how can you, using distributed ledger, create certainty of payment against exporting of trade? And that is, there's lots of experiments. Deloitte has been involved in one with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority happening in that space. And we're seeing fintechs being established that are using that technology. Indeed, at Deloitte, we have used blockchain technology to develop our own digital identity product called Optic. And we're also in the FCA sandbox at the moment, which is looking at digital identity in a consortia with Evonim, Distributed Ledger, and Onfido as an identity provider. So the three of us are just proving out against the that use case in the FCA.
So Fractal are also part of the FCA regulatory sandbox, and we did some cool things around understanding what it means for businesses. So an area we focused on was the smart contracts of loan agreements. So a smart contract is basically executing an agreement between two or more parties. So we digitized the loan using the Ethereum network, and we execute the payment using our PISP license. So it's a good way where it's a good example of how the fintech and blockchain ecosystem sort of can work together with open banking and provide utility to SMEs. Because I think a lot of people were confused about what is the utility of blockchain. And as Louise mentioned, in trade and in commerce, are we finding great use for blockchain?
I think the regulatory dimension to this is really interesting. So of course, one has in areas like FX and cross-border trading, disbursements and settlements on blockchain technology are an amazing opportunity to change the price point of delivery of those services, but actually also bring in all sorts of issues around transparency. And I think cross-border regulation of DLT technology is going to be a challenge. And again, I think being led out of Asia is as best I can tell right now, but will absolutely present a challenge, I think.
And what do you think are the kind of key risks associated with fintech? What would you advise for people to look out for when they're looking at rolling out new innovations? Yeah,
hey, look, Louise has already touched on this. I think there's again a real challenge between encouraging innovation, so giving small startups access to financial services, but ensuring that they're properly regulated. So actually, you take your customer or anti-money laundering provisions put in place by a large bank. The reality is they're very different today, actually, than some of the lightest, fast-moving startups, and so they. Creating there's a barrier to entry clearly, and I think again Louise made the point that there's very little differentiation potentially to be surfaced from meeting basic requirements. And so I think for regulators, finding that right balance between supporting innovation but ensuring that customers are kept safe is really, really important. And I think there are some really interesting opportunities there, building on open banking as we look at things like commercializing APIs. So actually, if you've got a platform for customer onboarding that you could access from a big bank who does that very, very well, and they could make those services available over commercial APIs, that's a really interesting dynamic, again, that I think we'll start to see unfolding, and I think OBIE, to their great credit, are driving streams of work around that. But yes, how you square that circle of let's move quickly, but let's keep people safe, I think is one of the challenges.
So one of the challenges I'll have, or risks with fintech, is it becomes male-dominated. And I say that as the female on the platform, with our lovely female moderator. And last year there was 3.3 billion of inward capital into the UK, into fintech. Only 1% of it went to a female CEO of a fintech. Now that has to be wrong for the industry. There has to be bias coming out of fintech solutions that will be biased against inclusivity of the female gender. And we know that's happening, and I think people are watching for that, and in the AI space it's already been picked up as there is potential bias in AI solutions. It will be wrong. Fintech has so much to contribute to kind of purpose and social good. It'll be very wrong if we can't address this balance of how many women use fintech, because there's not enough, how many women employed in fintech, and then how many women are actually set up and found fintech companies.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it seems like there are things happening. So we both attended the Women of Silicon Roundabout last week. So it's great to see what kind of events are going on in that space to encourage more female involvement and inclusion.
Yeah.
I think on inclusion, we really shouldn't forget that there are still large sectors of our society who either don't have access to the web or are not confident interacting that way. And of course, as we're all rushing to disrupt typical channels and engagement with customers, there are people who still rely on their post office or their bank account, and it becomes increasingly commercially unsustainable to interact in that way. And so again, it feels like there's a role for the public sector to legislate for that in some way, to ensure that we don't leave people behind who are not digitally au fait. It feels like a risk.
The other point I wanted to make was there's so much development work, so many great things coming out these new fintechs. The one thing we do have to be careful of, I think, is when it comes to integrations, is there's a rush to get these integrations out in the marketplace as well, and sometimes that'll be we have the issue ourselves, as you kind of want to, this is really excellent, we really want to get this guy, and there's that little propensity to try to push things a bit too quick, and so for me that, and then the experience that people have then when they try things, which if there was just a bit more time to get them correctly in place, it makes such a difference to the experience, and it just really helps things to go from there. So you were talking about challenger banks, and we integrate with pretty much all of them now, but it's varying degrees of integration that you kind of go through. So I think that's the next kind of level to really making, really opening the floodgate on a lot of these things, is just making sure, and it kind of comes a little bit into the legislation part as well, just making sure that goes through. And just to pick up on your point as well, about there's also a lot of customer facing, not business to business, but end user facing fintech. I was thinking there was one the other day I saw about getting paid your wages that you've earned, which is great sounds great on the face of it. Well, I've already worked 15 days this month, but then there's that danger of getting into a cycle of relying on pulling your wages forward. So lots of little things to kind of think about from that side as well.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think what we're seeing with fintech is that the innovation is moving at breakneck speed, especially because of all the policy in the UK and Europe. But as fintechs and as financial institutions, are we ensuring that the cybersecurity risk and the data privacy sort of strategy is in place to meet those innovation that we're all partaking in? So one thing I think we're seeing with challenger banks is that they're trying to make onboarding as seamless as possible. And what we've seen with some of the challenger banks is because they've sort of prioritised the design and the experience and sort of got rid of these these protocols that the big banks have had in place, is that again it's after the fact, you've onboarded not properly, you're having to close the bank accounts down or freeze them because of you're sort of mandated to by the KYC and AML rules, and which leads to great frustration for businesses who are thinking, I want this new challenger bank, let me go sign up. However, once you get some money paid in from your US payment portals, it blocks you out. And we need to make sure, I think, as an ecosystem, to ensure that both cybersecurity and the data privacy issues are sort of thought of when you're moving at these speeds.
And I think that gives a fabulous opportunity for fintechs that want to focus in the financial crime space, not creating the crime, but actually solving for it, because these hurdles are there to stop financial crime. So if we can have the innovation at that end as well, I think that would be best for everybody.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I'd like to cover as well is around navigating open banking. And Edward, perhaps we can come to you first. What challenges have you come across as an organisation trying to navigate open banking?
Yeah, so actually first on a positive, I think directionally it's going to be awesome, and we've already touched on the fact that I think it's being closely watched globally and replicated globally, and I think it will be part of a sort of a larger open data movement, so all of that's good. I think the nature of the implementation is again positive in the UK, given that we have the CMA 9 who are kind of ahead of most of the rest of the European curve, but even they, I think, are struggling to open up APIs to the schedules that they need to open up at. And I think the big challenge actually for organisations like Xero and FreeAgent and other businesses who are going to depend upon those APIs is how do you kind of set expectations with your customers and migrate them when the backdrop is still very fluid and very dynamic. We don't really know quite which banks are going to be ready and which banks are not. There's lots of talk about FCA providing exemptions or forbearance on certain banks for certain use cases. Stripe have been in the news talking about a hit on card payments and e-com, running into many tens of billions of euros. And so I think there's in fact it was typified last week when I was meeting with one of the financial institutions. What has begun as sort of murmurs of discontent is now quite a chorus, I think, at the door of the FCA. And so I think we will probably see some change, but understanding what that will be and when it will arrive and then supporting customers appropriately, I think is a real challenge for banks and fintechs operating within open banking.
Absolutely, thank you. And Yaz, I know Fractal remains heavily reliant on open banking APIs working.
Yeah.
So also be great to hear from you.
Yeah, so one thing we found quite difficult was standardizing these integrations we have to all these various different banks. So Fractal will have connections to 17 different banks, all of CMA 9, some challenges and some non-open banking. So internally we've called this process fractalizing. So we bring the data from all these various different sources that were pitched to be standard, but they're nothing. Yeah. They're nowhere near standard. And we're seeing in like the updates that they're making to the API that they are trying to do so, but it's all dependent on the bank sort of wanting to play ball. Some banks make it mandatory to provide certain data fields that us as a fintech or our end customers would find very useful. So we're sort of having to, I guess, do our own part on that open bank, that the part that open banking is missing, and we've created our own banking service so that any connection that comes in, there's a standard data flow into any solution that we're sort of powering. Another thing I think is a data sandbox. Fintechs want to use open banking. Fintechs want to use open banking to provide solutions for customers. But in order to do so, there's this chicken and egg problem of data. How can you convince an SME or anyone to connect a bank account when you're not providing enough value or utility? If open banking were to get together and provide this data sandbox that was useful, the last one they did, it was all anonymized. But providing a data sandbox that could actually be used to build models from or test different products and services so that you can go to the SME or to the end user and provide them utility straight off the bat, I think would be very helpful for the entire ecosystem.
Definitely, thank you.
Yeah, you touched on it earlier, Edward, is there's, I mean, it wasn't so long ago, I remember it was only a few years back when I was sat around in a meeting with pretty much all the main banks, and with HMRC and sort of saying we're never going to open up our accounts because we've all developed these different ways of doing it. And so it's amazing how quickly that's changed, and we talk about today the challenges there, but so it's phenomenal. But it is there are varying degrees. So we've been doing lots of open banking testing, and just some really weird things that happen with double kind of data coming through all sorts. So just little things that are different for every single bank. So you're right, and I think the biggest issue or concern is that the rug being pulled away, and there's no kind of safety net basically. So these have to be ready for when it all happens. So but it's encouraging. There's lots there, but as you said, Edward, it's just making sure that we're going to get there on time.
Again, though, the world is looking at what we're doing here, and I mentioned Cybos. Last year it was in Sydney, and of course Australia is opening up with their open banking.
Yep.
And in FinTech Week this year, we announced the UK to Australia FinTech Bridge, And I know a lot of organisations are being asked about experience with open banking and what are the lessons we can learn from the regulator through the incumbents through to the fintechs themselves.
Great, thank you. And final question for the benefit of the audience, really. Are there any recommendations of any books, resources or conferences that you have in mind to give people an opportunity to learn a bit more about fintech or get involved in kind of other communities?
David Breer would kill me if somebody didn't plug FinTech Insider, which is a podcast run by 11FS, and actually, you know, they have a really active podcast platform. I'm sure, I imagine probably people here have been on it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great source. There are some great conferences like Money 2020, and again, I have to plug XeroCon, which is our own conference. We run annually an accountants conference. About 80% of small businesses are are represented in some way by an accountant or bookkeeper. So we tend to work with that community to not only help them progress their skills around core accounting, but actually again start to embrace some of these other fintech opportunities. And so we had about 80 exhibitors at that event, many of whom were banks and fintechs, beginning to talk about how they can streamline the work that accountants do. And 48% female attendees.
Brilliant.
So really strong, diverse group actually of digitally savvy accountants and bookkeepers who are keen to kind of learn about and take advantage of some of these new evolving technologies.
Great, thank you.
The other area I would go, it's two ends of the spectrum of where you might go to meet up with people. One would be, there are some major conferences like Money 2020, like Innovate Finance Global Summit, which Deloitte has headline sponsored for the last 3 years. Like Cybos, the world's largest, we've talked about payments throughout this conversation, the largest payments conference in the world. London is hosting it this year. There are cheaper tickets for people that are in the more student category rather than exhibitors. And the Singapore FinTech Festival I mentioned. So there are the big ones, but you need to be sort of probably with a corporate mindset to want to attend those, or a company mindset. I would go right down the other end of the spectrum and say, get onto Eventbrite and just have a look at what's happening. The meetups are fabulous. People with ideas, it's a pizza and a beer or whatever the format is, but great conversations. You'll see fintechs at different stages and you'll be able to learn and meet founders and have a really good time.
Great,
yeah,
thanks.
I would definitely agree with that. There's lots of was at a Satago event the other week, and while they're obviously focused on the products that we're all building, they have very good guest speakers as well. So you get a real good mixture, a real good view, and some pizza and beer as well, which is really important.
So I would say just reach out to a fintech and just go and ask them what's going on and how it could impact you or impact the economy. Fractal likes to sort of stay very close to SMEs, so we're always inviting them in to find out their problems. I wouldn't say to reaching out like a cold email or a cold call to a fintech, just ask them, what does your fintech mean for me? I'd absolutely encourage that. We love speaking to our end customers and SMEs, so yeah, just reach out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been an incredibly insightful conversation, and I think that it's been hopefully very useful to our audience as well. So big thank you to everyone. Thanks very much. We're actually now going to go to Q&A to get into a bit more detail. So please do ask any questions you have. We've got a chat bot which you'll be able to use for any questions you want to ask any of our panel guests. Big thank you again, and let's go to Q&A.